Thank you all so much for joining us today as we learn about opportunities to welcome asylum seekers. This webinar is brought to you by Mennonite Central Committee. Sorry, one moment. MCC is a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches that shares God's love and compassion in the name of Christ by responding to basic human needs and working for peace and justice. One of our 3 areas of focus is increasing the capacity of our partners to uplift displaced people across the world, including the United States. Within the United States, MCC provides a variety of supports to our immigrant and refugee neighbors. One way that we provide support and advocacy is through education on different immigration issues. We also advocate for humane, sensible immigration laws and encourage peace building along the U.S.-Mexico border. And within each region of Mennonite Central Committee, we offer immigration documentation services for immigrants as they try to navigate a very complex system in the United States. My name is Charity Stowell. I am the Newcomer Connections Coordinator, and my role is to help connect individuals and faith communities to organizations serving refugees and asylum seekers. In addition, as you welcome, if you need connections to resources or education, please reach out. We can help you connect to resources on a variety of topics depending on what your needs are. And then finally, our goal is to build a network of welcoming Anabaptist communities to connect with each other, support one another, and provide best practices. If you'd like to connect, again, my name is Charity and my email is really simple. It's just welcome@mcc.org. So today we will be talking about welcoming asylum seekers, and we have 4 different speakers who will be joining us. Katherine Smith is the MCC West Coast Border and Migration Outreach Coordinator, and she'll be sharing a little bit more about just who are asylum seekers, what is the asylum process, and she'll also be sharing some basic information. Then we'll be hearing from Cecilia Valenzuela, who is a volunteer with Casa Mariposa Detention Visitation Center, and she'll be sharing about opportunities to accompany asylum seekers who find themselves in detention centers. And then finally, we're going to be joined by Reverend Chris McNabb and Jessica Sapalio to learn more about ways that congregations can work together to sponsor and accompany asylum seekers in their own community. Before we learn more from Kat, I wanted us to first join together to say a prayer of intercession as we consider the journey that many people are forced to make. This is a prayer of intercession from MCC Canada's 2018 World Refugee Day Worship Guide. And we'll share this entire guide with you later on. But let's pray together. Our loving and compassionate God, we know you grieve where there is violence, where there is oppression, where there is hatred in the world. We know you stand with refugees in our world today, just as you stood with our ancestors in the faith, who were compelled to flee their homes, like Moses, like Ruth, like Jeremiah, like Paul, and even like Jesus and his parents. We pray for comfort for those who mourn. We hold before you those who have lost their homes, those who have lost their communities, those who have lost their families. We grieve with them and long to reach out to them to bring your healing comfort. We pray for peace, O God. We pray that those who bring war will change their ways and beat their swords into plowshares. We pray for meaningful reconciliation in broken communities where hate is sown in the soil of prejudice and watered by our indifference. We pray for courage and wisdom as we look for ways to be your agents of comfort and peace in a world that needs your holy and healing touch. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. And so, in recognition that we live in a world that needs Christ's holy and healing touch, I am going to pass this presentation over to Kat.
Well, as Charity pulls up the slide, good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast like I am. Thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Kat Smith and I work for the West Coast region of Mennonite Central Committee in Tucson, Arizona. And I am the Border and Migration Outreach Coordinator, which allows me to work directly with people who have recently arrived in the U.S. and then also do things like this, teach others about kind of the immigration process in the U.S. So I want to start by kind of briefly defining what asylum means in the U.S. Context, because the term can vary kind of among countries. However, the definition of refugee or asylee, they do have the same definition. So I'm going to give some background on asylum and how it kind of came to be. I'm not seeing my slide, Charity. Is that coming?
One moment. Let me stop sharing for a second and I'll share it again.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. So yes, asylum history at a glance. So kind of going very briefly, 1945, the United Nations was created. And so that was around 50 countries that came together. And then kind of fast forward a few years, 1951, they then held the Refugee Convention. And that's when 145 countries came together. And this is where they defined the term refugee. And so they outlined the rights of refugees as well as like the legal obligations of states or signatories that were present to protect them. And so at this time in 1951, this kind of refugee status was really reserved for people who were displaced after World War II. And then after that, 15 years later, over 15 years later, the UN kind of came together again in 1967 and they created the protocol, the 1967 protocol, meaning that the refugee definition was no longer just restricted to those affected by World War II, but it was open to all people who met the definition, which I'll get to after this. So the US signed on to this treaty in 1967, which means that they agreed to the terms outlined for refugees at the Refugee Convention. However, it wasn't until 1980 that the US codified the law, which then actually obligated the US to uphold the terms and rights of refugees. You can go to the next slide. So getting to actually the definition. So like I said, asylum and refugee, they share the same term or definition. So this term is defined and protected in international law as someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their home country based on past persecution or a well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future. And there's kind of 5 reasons or accounts. So that would be race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And so kind of just to decipher, refugee versus asylum. So they have the same definition. It just kind of changes based on where someone is either applying for this protective status or gaining it. So someone who is granted refugee status, they're granted the protective status before arriving to the U.S. It's something that you apply for outside of you're outside of your home country and outside of the host country that you will possibly be going to. And then an asylum seeker, an asylee, is someone who is flees their home. They reach a land or sea border, and then upon arriving at that border, they request protective status. And then they go through the process to gain protection, to gain asylum, and in this case, in the U.S. And so in this presentation, we will focus on the U.S. And people who are arriving at land or sea borders, and then going through the process of seeking asylum. But I also want to highlight just that migration is global, and that although there are thousands of people who are, arriving at the U.S. border daily, it's said that about 85% of displaced people are in their areas of origin. So meaning the global South. And so that countries like the US are instrumental in keeping refugees and asylum seekers in the global South, where resources are even more so limited than they are in the US. So I'm now, going to explain a bit more about the experience for asylum seekers at the border, the Mexico-US border. Which I can't really explain well without going into some details of what policies or rules that are affecting migrants at the southern US border. So I will go over these kind of briefly, but just kind of get our minds in kind of what people have gone through and what they continue to go through just to reach the border. So what happens to asylum seekers arriving at the southern US border? I'm going to go back about 4 years and begin with metering. So in 2018, this was kind of in response to family separation. The US began capping the amount of people who could enter the US daily seeking asylum. So this kind of stopped people from being able to state their credible fear of returning to their home country, which would be based on the accounts of race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion. So this created a backlog of people who were waiting to enter the US. And then around that time, they also started migrant protection protocols. The US started migrant protection protocols, or remain in Mexico. So this began in 2018. It arrived to Arizona, where I am, in 2019. And so this is when the US started to return people who passed their credible fear interviews, meaning they did have a credible fear of returning to their home country, and they were eligible to begin the asylum process in the US. However, upon entering the US, they were processed and then returned to Mexico and just given a future court date that they would have to go to months later. And so this mainly caused a lot of confusion and chaos for those who had already waited due to metering, waited months to enter the US, and then they were told that they had to wait even longer in Mexico. And then about a year later, the border closure happened. And this was due to COVID, which we all know really, disrupted a lot of aspects of our lives. And this was kind of used or seen as a way to close the border between the US and Mexico. So essentially, anyone without US citizenship was unable to enter the US through a port of entry along the southern US border. And the group that was the most affected by this policy, I would say, were migrants who were fleeing and with the intention of seeking asylum. So they have metering, MPP, the border closure, kind of closing the border off, and then Title 42, which was pretty much in tandem with the border closure. So this border policy that was enacted was kind of seen, it is a public health rule that was and still is being used to prohibit and people entering the U.S. When there's a risk of introduction of a communicable disease. So essentially, border officials through Title 42, and I'm speaking in the past, but this is still present. But at this time in March 2020, they were given the right or authority to expel people seeking safety in the United States without giving them any opportunity to explain their fears, their credible fear. And, you know, this is, they're expelling them even though the U.S. through the 1967 protocol and through our laws that we signed in 1980, through the U.S. law guaranteeing the right for asylum seekers to seek safety, and it prohibits people, prohibits sending people to places they will be persecuted or tortured. So this is still in place. So with all of this, you can kind of see for the past 4 years, and we could go back more, but just at least the past 4 years, under 2 different administrations, there have been significant policies and practices that have essentially, you know, closed off or dismantled the asylum system, which again reiterates kind of the fact that the U.S. has failed to protect refugees or asylum seekers in this case, and it violates the refugee laws and treaties that we have signed on to, which in theory should ensure asylum seekers are not turned away or away to persecution. So I kind of have a graph, the next slide, you can actually show those pictures. So these pictures were taken in 2018 and 19. So on the left, you can see this is when metering began, and you know, it created this backlog of mainly families seeking asylum. So you can see kind of on the left, there's a family of 5 just waiting outside of the port of entry, waiting to state their credible fear to begin the asylum process. And then on the right, you can see as more and more people were sent back to Mexico, this is when kind of more makeshift temporary housing tent cities began. And now you can go to the graph. So this, I'm going to kind of shift now. So we have put many policies where we are just sending people back to their home countries or to countries they've never been, or to what's most convenient for the US, Mexico. So the navy blue on the left, you can see these are the expulsions. So this is February 2021 to April of 2022. So you can see almost pretty much for a year and a half, over or about 50% of people were expelled and just sent back to Mexico under Title 42. And then you can see kind of on the right side, the palish blue or periwinkle, that is released directly at the border. So we do have people, we're expelling some people, but then other people are allowed to stay and state their credible fear and enter into the US and start the asylum process. However, I will just say that this is more or less subjective, and I'm not a border official, so I cannot explain this graph of why some people are expelled and why other people are, you can see it says released directly at the border. So that means what it sounds like, people enter the US, they're not sent back, but they are just kind of go through a process and then they are just in the US without any resources really. So that's when humanitarian groups will come in and either take them to airports, to bus stations, or to shelters. And then kind of to segue into our next speaker, you can see in the middle, there is this gray line or gray chunk. So that is ICE detention, or state or federal jail. And so that's where we see, I think in January of 2021, of this year, there were about 14,715 people in immigration detention. And so these are majority people who are immigrants who are coming to the US, and a lot of them are seeking asylum. So they have entered the US, they do have a credible fear of returning to their home country, but a lot of them for many different reasons, but one of them, maybe they do not have a sponsor, so they're seen as a flight risk, so they will be sent to an immigration detention center. And so you can see the numbers for June of this year, the beginning of this month. There were 24,591 immigrants in detention. So even from January of this year to June, it jumped about 10,000 people. So the amount of people in detention, immigration detention, has risen by about 10,000 people. So you can, I think, go to the next slide. So as part of my work with MCC, I work with, it's called the Casa Mariposa Detention Visitation Program. And so my colleague Cecilia, is Cecilia on? I'm not sure yet. We will be explaining more about the program and the people that we work with. But at any given time, there can be around 40,000 people in immigration detention. And so these are for-profit, most of them are for-profit detention centers that are detaining migrants and a lot of asylum seekers. So this is a place where people's belongings are taken. They're given an alien registration number or an A number. They're referred to as that, opposed to their names. There's little to no access to phones, internet, lawyers, legal help. With COVID, it was described as a tinderbox, just kind of, with the close proximity and lack of PPE. And people are treated as criminals when most of them have done nothing but ask for a chance to seek asylum, or even access the asylum system to start a claim that really could last, 2 to 5 years on average. I will explain just a little bit of the Casa Mariposa detention visitation program. So we are a group of about 10 volunteers who have gained access to be able to enter the detention centers and just visit with people. And so a lot of, I would say half of the people do have sponsors in the U.S., meaning they have family, friend, or church who they can go to, and then about half don't. And so these, they're kind of forced to go through their immigration, their asylum case within the detention center. So the visitation program, we mainly communicate through letters now. Because of COVID, we can't enter into the facility. So we'll send letters to accompany people, and we will have different, like phone calls with people. We are able to offer phone money for them to be able to make phone calls, commissary, so that they can buy better food or hygiene items. We can help with translation. So a lot of the times everything is in English. So if you need to write your testimony for your asylum claim, someone would need to translate that for you. And then we help with post-release support. So once someone has left detention, we can help pay for a bus ticket or a plane ticket, a phone for someone to be able to travel to their sponsor. And I have these two highlighted, bond support and sponsorship. These are the things, the two main things that are stopping people from being able to leave detention. So either they do not have a sponsor in the U.S., meaning they don't have a place to go once they leave detention. And then also bond support. A lot of people do have family and friends or churches or groups who are willing to receive them. But their immigration judge has given them a bond of maybe $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 and up for someone to leave. So what we kind of do as a volunteer group is reach out to different organizations, different churches, to see who can sponsor someone and who can help us pay if they do have a bond. And I'm not sure if Cecilia is on. She was going to share a few stories. She's a volunteer with Casa Mariposa, but her internet went out this morning right before we started. So I might just pass it on to Chris and Jessica, and then if there's questions at the end about Casa Mariposa, I can answer those.
Great. One moment. I will get up your their PowerPoint in one moment. Let me just figure. Okay, great. We'll pass it on to Chris and Jessica.
Well, hi, everyone. It is a delight to be with you all this morning and talk a little bit about our work. I'll leave it to Jess to kick us off.
Sure. Yes, I echo that sentiment. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar and to join all of you. Chris and I are going to be talking about congregational models to support asylum seekers. So kind of as a follow-up to what Kat was talking about, when people are in need of sponsorship, either to get out of detention or sometimes to receive humanitarian parole that lets them cross one of our borders, then they're sometimes in need of full sponsorship that often comes in the form of congregations providing that to them and providing a whole variety of services. So Chris and I are each we'll introduce ourselves and then walk you through the models that our organizations use for congregational sponsorship. Again, I'm Jessica Sapalio. I'm with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We are an international human rights organization that has our foundings in a retired, actually not retired, a UU minister and his wife who during World War II went to Germany to rescue Jewish children. And from that, we've had an ongoing history of working with refugees and asylum seekers around the world. Chris, like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris McNabb. I'm an Episcopal priest serving as the program manager for Neighbor to Neighbor, a program of Episcopal Migration Ministries. EMM is one of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies, and Neighbor to Neighbor is a newer addition to our work that does the work of welcoming asylum seekers as well as newly arriving Afghans through the model known as community sponsorship.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, both of our programs operate somewhat similarly, but we'll each take turns walking you through. My program under the UUSC is called the Congregational Accompaniment Project for Asylum Seekers. And we work with congregations, both Unitarian Universalist congregations, but also congregations of other faith groups all around the country. And our program has approximately 4 different elements to it. Our main one is the congregational full sponsorship model that I will be talking to in detail. But we also work in family reunification for families who were separated at the border under the past administration. And we work with congregations to help support those families when they're reunited in whatever local communities they're in. Then we also identify folks that don't need full sponsorship, but just need a sponsor in order to come out of detention or receive humanitarian parole, as I mentioned. And then we also work with some unaccompanied minors from Afghanistan, trying to reunite them with their families that are still in Kabul. So that's just kind of a overview of what we're doing. But to get to the part that we're here to really talk about today and dig into is our congregation kind of full sponsorship or hosting model. And I'll just sort of walk you through ours and what it looks like, and then I'll turn it over to Chris to talk in detail about his program and how it works. But the first step is our faith communities reach out to us. We'll be sharing our website and our information on how to do that at the end of the program. And I should say that we do partner with charities. So we can work closely with your congregations and charity to make this happen if you're interested. So our faith communities reach out to us to say we're interested. You know, we get a lot of interest right now, especially around Afghans and Ukrainians. But our program is really targeted at asylum seekers. So as you heard from Kat, they have a lot of similarities, refugees and asylum seekers. But what we find is that asylum seekers are often left without some of the resettlement benefits that some refugees get. And not that refugees are getting a whole lot in terms of governmental support, but they do get something, whereas asylum seekers don't. So our program largely focuses on that population. So faith groups come to us, say we're interested, how do we do this? How do we support somebody in our community? And we walk them through a discernment process. We have a handbook, which I'll be sharing a link to later, to help congregations think that through. We ask that they pull together a team of volunteers that are really dedicated to making this work in their congregation. We go through an education process on a whole variety of things, ranging from just the nitty-gritty of how you do this work, but also important topics like trauma-informed care, charity versus solidarity, and some of the differences there, et cetera, and really help congregations think in a deep way about how this is tied to their faith and to their missions and to their social justice work. And then once congregations, decide that this is something that they want to do, we work in prep with their volunteer teams to fundraise, to develop their welcome plans so that they kind of have an idea of how to help their guests set goals once they arrive, and to start to reach out to community groups that they might be able to partner with. Then once they're ready to go, then we work with a number of different partner organizations that are either working with people at the border or in detention centers, and some others to find a potential guest or guest family, and find a good match. So at that point, we're doing introductions. It's often a Zoom meeting if possible. That sometimes isn't possible if folks are in detention. But then we look to find the best match. And then the guests arrive, and we continue to work and mentor our congregations as they go through the process of working with guests. I'd say most people are hosting guests for somewhere between 1 to 2 years until they're really starting to form enough community connections that they can be successful living more independently. And we have kind of two different models. Some of our congregations actually have their guests living with congregants that are their housing hosts, and some find a separate housing, either renting an apartment or maybe they have housing on their congregation's campus. So that's kind of a general overview of the process. Chris, do you want to share yours?
Absolutely. So similar to Jess, we invite congregations to go onto our website and fill out an initial interest form. And then we have weekly information sessions held every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, where individuals are welcome to come and learn more about what we do. And through that, we send a whole list of resources for folks to start learning a little bit more about our work and to sort of do some study time on their own. And then from there, we encourage folks, similar to Jess's program, to fill out a welcome plan and start the process. And then once the welcome plan is vetted and approved, we connect with the referrals that we have of asylum seekers who are in need of a sponsor. And then we go about the work of making that connection and walking with them. We do ask congregations to make a minimum of a 6-month commitment. Certainly individuals, congregations are invited to do more than 6 months, but we find that that's really the minimum amount of time that it takes to really help someone get settled and start getting connected to other resources in the community that can help support them in the long term.
Right, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that our congregations, I should say, are offering many types of support. So of course we think about the basics. People need housing. And like I said, they could be in home or in separate housing. I think Chris's program largely does separate housing. Then of course, setting people up with basic needs, clothing, food, medical care, therapy, etc. And our congregations find different ways to do this. Sometimes they're paying outright for services, but a lot of times there's community connections that can be built, whether it's with local food banks or health clinics, or we've had even people put out on their, neighborhood Facebook groups. Does anybody, are there any dentists out there willing to provide discounted dental care or whatever? Congregations get really creative about how to find services to help their guests. So once kind of those basics are taken care of and in place, I'd say the next most important thing is legal representation. So our congregations are seeking out pro bono legal representation. We know that people's chances of success with their asylum case really skyrockets if they have legal representation. I shouldn't say skyrockets. It's still a very rough and low odds success rate, but it definitely vastly goes up with legal representation. And if they're unable to find legal pro bono legal representation, then congregations often fundraise to cover that cost. I'd say a lot of our volunteers are spending a lot of their time with transportation. Most asylum seekers, this is sort of state dependent, but can't get a driver's license at least until they have a work permit, which often takes about 6 months. They help them with ESL courses, getting connected to those, and other language support, interpretation and translation services, education support, especially if they have children, or if they're interested in job training or studying for driver's license, kind of all of these things that we all take for granted in our sort of everyday lives, but that people are really starting over from scratch and are oftentimes doing it in a foreign language. And then we find another key piece that sometimes, we don't think about, but helping them build those social connections. It's a very isolated feeling coming to a place. It's completely foreign. I would say the one common characteristic of all asylum seekers is that they have experienced some form of trauma, whether that's, from the reason that they left their home country, or the journey that they were on to get to the United States. So they often need time to kind of just, relax, settle into their space, and then kind of follow up on their basics. But we do see that they, eventually need to start reaching out and building those social connections, both for their own mental health and general enjoyment, but also so that they have a real community around them beyond the congregation when it's time for them to transition out of our program. Chris, are there other services that your congregations are offering?
No, I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to, rather than have you just hear from us about what this experience is like, we wanted to give one of our asylum seeking guests an opportunity to share her story being hosted by a congregation. So this is Yadira, who's being hosted by a congregation in Minnesota.
Empezar de cero en otro país, con otro idioma, otra cultura, de por sí es muy difícil, pero en medio de todo eso nosotros fuimos muy bendecidos al encontrar personas tan buenas como la gente de la iglesia. Hemos encontrado mucha gente buena que siempre ha estado ahí para nosotros y que todavía siguen pendientes de nosotros. Nuestro país está ahorita atravesando por la crisis más grande que ha habido, creo, en la historia. Así que del resultado de esas elecciones dependemos de muchas formas. Nosotros estamos solicitando asilo político por persecución política. Este año ha sido muy, no diré complicado, como ha sido triste, ha dejado tristezas y alegrías en nuestra familia. Pues mi mamá murió este año allá en nuestro país y pues lo más duro que me ha tocado vivir es no estar ahí para despedirla. Y eso ha sido lo más duro que nos ha tocado vivir desde que estamos aquí. Pero Dios nos bendijo y cuando mi mamá se fue nos enteramos que estamos esperando otro bebé. Le decía que muchas gracias porque yo sé que ellos nos han ayudado mucho a través de esta iglesia de aquí de Colombia. Hemos recibido todas las ayudas que nos han mandado. Nos han apoyado mucho con los gastos de la abogada y nos han apoyado emocionalmente más que todo y han sido una familia para nosotros, pero que han sido nuestra familia y que siguen siendo nuestra familia aquí en Columbia, Missouri. Yo sé que ustedes forman parte de eso y aunque no los conozcamos, de verdad, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Chris, I'll let you take the lead on the next slide, since I've been doing all the talking.
Thanks. So, there are definitely all sorts of challenges and opportunities in this work. So one of the challenges is to certainly offer trauma-informed solidarity. So recognizing that, really that but by the grace of God, there we would go. And so really stepping into solidarity with the individuals with whom we've been called to serve. Avoiding the notion that we are called to ride in on horseback and save people, but rather that we do have connections and resources within our communities that we are willing to share, and we're willing to partner with folks. But the people don't need to be saved. They do need connections and resources which we can help them find. One of the challenges in this work, and is true of refugee resettlement in general, is that all humans love certainty. And that is just not something that you're going to get in this work. So things are constantly changing. I sometimes will take a personal day and I'll come back and an entire new policy has been enacted and we have to completely change everything. So there is very little certainty in this work, and we often say that we are called to stumble forward with an open heart. With that said, there are great opportunities, which include developing a deeper understanding of the challenges that our migrant sisters and brothers face, to challenge the undignified immigration systems. Our immigration systems are deeply, deeply out of touch with the lived reality of most immigrants. They are in many decades and decades old that have not been updated to reflect the modern challenges and realities that we see. And so, we are called to use our privilege and our power to really challenge these systems and to ask for change. And then finally, it's the ultimate opportunity for us as people of faith is to put our faith into action through that work of welcome and solidarity.
And I would just add, and so many more. Like Chris said, with the uncertainty, there's challenges pop up all of the time. It's I always say to people, these are people's lives. We're not going to do this work perfectly. We're going to do it the best we can. And, I think congregations sometimes are, hesitant to get into it because we don't know what to expect, but that's also the beauty of it, because we don't also realize the number of gifts that we're given by doing the work, and the friendships that develop and the insights that we all gain in our lives. So it's really an incredible thing that's hard to even imagine before you're into it. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do your faith communities get started? Like I said at the beginning, we are more than happy to share resources that we have. I've listed both of our programs' websites here. We have a number of things that we can share with you. We have a handbook, as I mentioned, that kind of walks through the detailed process of doing this. And I know Chris has a number of similar resources as well. And we're happy to work with both your congregations in partnership with Charity to help you figure out how to get started. If you're from a different faith group, outside of the Mennonites, we're happy to talk with you about how you can set up a national program like ours for your faith community. But we're also just happy to be consultants on individual congregation work as well. And if you would ever want to actually join in our programs, we both work with congregations of many faiths. So we would be more than happy to have you. Chris, did you want to add anything?
Just that similarly, we also welcome faith communities from all different denominations and would be happy to continue the conversation. Thanks for being here.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. And now we have some time for questions that people have. I think there were quite a few in the chat. So yeah, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A section, and our speakers can try to answer the questions. So I see one right now from Steve. It says, do you have any special programs for unaccompanied minors?
I would say for our program, UUSC, the unaccompanied minor programs that we worked about were briefly what I mentioned at the beginning, working with unaccompanied Afghan minors, as well as unaccompanied minors who now are being reunited with their families. Chris, do you all have anything specific?
No, we don't have any particular programs working with unaccompanied minors. So if that's something you're passionate about, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to Jess for that.
Great. Another question we have, which I imagine maybe Chris could answer, where do folks arriving with humanitarian parole fit into these models? It seems like they fall between the cracks between, I think, probably refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, so humanitarian parole is a unique subset of immigration law, which it's a category that essentially allows DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, to get people out of situations where there is an emergent need. So it was enacted during the fall of Kabul in order to evacuate folks from Afghanistan, right? Because we knew that their lives were in jeopardy because of the invading reality of Taliban. So to answer the question, it really depends on the individual sending country, what resources are available. One of the complexities of immigration law is it's largely determined by the executive branch, the president. And so the current president has enacted humanitarian parole for Afghans. And so there have been specific programs that were offered to them. But as I understand it, it's more country dependent. And so it's hard to answer in a broad sense what would be available to humanitarian parolees, because it's a little more specific and a little more detailed than a parolees as a larger subset.
I will just add to that, many of the guests that come into our program actually do arrive with humanitarian parole. It's often can be used at the border. There are many legal advocacy organizations working with folks at the border, and they can put in humanitarian parole applications that can be based on, as Chris said, they're kind of emergency needs. They might be, for instance, be medically based, or in the past, traditionally, it was used for things like, I have a family member who's very ill that I want to be allowed to come see on short notice. But now it's being used to get people into the United States. And then oftentimes they can be granted all different lengths of humanitarian parole. I'd say most of what we see is 1 year. Sometimes they'll grant them just short of a year to make sure they don't qualify for certain benefits, unfortunately. But in general, a lot of those people do then tend to apply for asylum once they arrive. They have 1 year from the time that they enter the United States to apply for asylum.
Great, thank you. Another question we had, which it's a little bit specific to a region, was are there job training organizations working with current Afghan evacuees? But I think we could also even broaden that too. Do you know of job training programs for asylum seekers even before they've been granted asylum too?
Yeah, so one of the complexities that I think a few folks were talking about it in the chat, is that asylum seekers need to wait 6 months before they're eligible to apply for a work permit or employment authorization documents, whereas newly arriving Afghans are able to receive those. Usually they are applied for on base, so either at the if folks arrived at the U.S. military bases, or if they're at the current central processing center. And so as a result, Afghans are able to access those services much more quickly. I will post in the chat here an organization called Upwardly Global that has specific programs for Afghans. I don't know all of the cities where they're located, but I don't know if they have an office in Baltimore, is what someone asked. But I just popped that link in the chat and would invite you to look into that. And I think there was a second section to the question that I forgot.
Yeah.
Oh, just around job training programs in general. So there are certainly, a lot of that is like town and city specific. And so I would encourage you to look into what resources are available for individuals in your town, county, state, et cetera. And if those services are eligible, if asylum seekers are eligible for those services.
I would add that I know for Afghans specifically, we've been hearing that there's been a lot of encouragement for Afghans to consider the Job Corps program. And I will say for younger Afghans, the program is for 16 to 24-year-olds. But it is an amazing job training and education program that is free. And in terms of Baltimore, there is a center about half an hour west of Baltimore in Woodstock, Maryland.
Yeah, great. Let me see if there are some other questions. I
know someone, Charity, had asked about the Afghan Adjustment Act, so I can speak a little bit to that.
Yes, please. Yeah, please.
So there's a good amount of advocacy work right now around the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is essentially the bill passing through or that we're hoping will pass through Congress to basically allow the parolees from Afghanistan to adjust automatically without needing to apply for asylum. And so there is some advocacy work happening. Of course, we encourage you to contact your members of Congress. If you are interested in doing a little more than that, I would welcome you to reach out to me. I can pop my email in the chat again. The Episcopal Church's Office for Government Relations is working with a number of partners to do the advocacy with key members of Congress who we think are important to vote on this issue. So that's important to you. Like I said, I'll pop my email in the chat and happy to connect you with our Office for Government Relations.
And somebody from the chat, Jenny Close, also pointed out that a lot of employers are willing to hire people even despite their English language abilities. So reaching out to federal job centers and local chambers of Congress is also a good way to go, especially once people do receive their employment authorization. Emily asked the question. She'd love to hear more about the discernment process, what the discernment process within congregation looks like within congregations.
Chris, do you want to talk about yours first?
Sure. So within the Episcopal churches, we have a vestry, which is also sort of a church board. And so we generally encourage folks who are interested in this work to reach out to their pastor. The pastor usually brings it before the church board, and they have some discussions around what it may look like and what are possibilities. I did just pop our website in the chat, so folks can certainly reach out, can check out our website around sort of what the possibilities are. But essentially, it's that filling out that initial interest form, attending the weekly information sessions. I'm around for questions as things come up. And then we'll walk you through the whole process of filling out the welcome plan, getting your congregation on board, all that kind of stuff.
And ours is very similar. You know, my colleagues and I have initial conversations with whoever the team leader is at the congregation, as well as the minister. And then from that point, we have a number of questions, and I will also put our website in where you can find our handbook, and you can see some of the questions that we're asking groups to kind of think through themselves, you know, everything from their values and how it fits with their faith, to, you know, the financial commitment involved. We often suggest that congregations raise at least $5,000 to $7,000 before they welcome a guest, and then approximately another $10,000 to $15,000, depending on the size of the family. Some people might just be hosting one asylum seeker. Some people might have, you know, a family of 4 or more. So really kind of weighing how many in-kind donations you're going to get, et cetera. You know, what are the cross-cultural experiences that people on your core team have had? What additional trainings might be helpful, et cetera. And then we, if the congregation is going to use the model of finding a housing host where they're going to have the guests stay with them in their home, we generally go through and interview that person and talk about some of the challenges that could arise from having someone, just in general, having a roommate if they're not used to that, and also, you know, living with someone that comes with a different cultural background, and just, you know, going through answering all the questions that come up through this process. Like Chris said, you know, I'm there, you know, holding everybody's hand as they go through and make their plans. But there is, as we talked about, so much that you can't plan for. And I know Chris and I are always available to congregations to just, you know, pick up the phone and be like, okay, now what? Or even just to vent. I mean, this is definitely challenging work, for sure. And we're definitely here to guide congregations over those bumps and also to share in their joys. So, and then it goes from there. And once congregations say, yes, we're ready to go, and give us a timeline, then we move forward.
Thank you. We have another question for Kat. How can people support visitation programs like Casa Mariposa with books or sending letters or cards?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, something, you know, that I didn't mention, but just kind of the mental state of people who are in detention. There's like a lack of autonomy, lack of control of your environment. There's prolonged uncertainty of your future, exclusion, discrimination, family separation, and you don't have access to things, to certain things that could help you with your case. So accompaniment is a huge just help in supporting someone's mental health. So people can kind of 2 different ways, I would say, either financial donations, so that we can, there are many different rules. So you can't just mail someone a book. It would have to go through usually like the provider, but you could give us financial donations so that we can, we provide books. So a lot of people, you know, are seeking for spiritual types of books, or sometimes like self-help books. Or I know one person, we've sent him like remodeling, building a tiny home, plumbing, so that, you know, people can keep their minds active while they're in detention. So providing books is a way to support us, providing donations for books. And then we do have like letter writing parties. So if you have, you know, a congregation and you have, or like a small group or something, and you want to, either you can just send letters once. So you'll write letters to us and I can send out information, and then we'll send it to people who are detained. And then you could either become like pen pals with that person. And sometimes, you know, that's just quick. They are in detention for a month and then leave. Or sometimes, you know, people are detained for upwards of, you know, 2, 3, 4 years. And so that really kind of can solidify a relationship and a lifeline for someone who might not know anyone in the U.S. So yeah, I would say, and then financial donations for helping with bond support as well. There are a lot of people who are given bonds. They maybe have family or sponsors in the US, but like I said, they can't leave because they have a $3,000 bond. So any donations help us then pay that bond. And the one, positive thing about immigration bonds is that they are returned once the case is closed. So if someone is granted asylum or even denied asylum, that money that was put towards the bond is then returned to the person who paid it. So then and that's a long process, but to kind of see that money returned, but it does happen, and then you can continue to pay bonds. So that's a huge help. So yeah, I would say if you're interested, if your congregation or you just as an individual are interested in either writing with someone or supporting someone financially, I can connect you with Casa Mariposa.
Yes, and in our email, I will work with all of them to kind of create some lists too of ways that you can connect with Casa Mariposa and connect with Episcopal Migration Ministries and UUSC's CAPAS program. I also just wanted to highlight in the messages we just received kind of a success story from one of our attendees. One of our members stepped up, asked a couple of us who were interested about asylum seeker sponsorship, reached out to other churches, and once they had a small group of people willing to step out in faith, they went to their church council for a vote of support, and they used a church 501c3 for fundraising, and they received about $25,000 with in kind, and it was not as big of an issue as they expected. And I think that's one story that I've heard from congregations who have stepped out into faith to welcome asylum seekers too, is that once you say yes, and once you've formed your group and are kind of taking the steps, a lot of people and a lot of resources will come out of the woodwork. It feels very biblical, like when Christ calls us to knock, and the door will be opened. So I just encourage you all, even though it is a huge commitment, and we don't want to, sugarcoat that at all, that it is possible. And many churches and congregations have been doing this for quite a long time. Chris has to leave us because he has another meeting, but if there are any other questions, we would love to answer them, or you can also reach out to me afterwards at my email, welcome@mcc.org, and we can have a longer conversation.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be with you all. And I know that I'm leaving you all in good hands here. Take good care.
Thanks, Chris. And unfortunately, Cecilia cannot make it today, but we are hoping that we might be able to record a conversation with her later on and share that conversation with you all in the future too. So you can hear some of Cecilia's stories of accompanying folks who are unfortunately in detention centers as we speak. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll just close us. So in ending, I encourage you to pray together, share what you have learned with other people in your community. If you're interested in walking in faith and learning more about welcoming asylum seekers, you can always reach out to any of the speakers or myself, and we can help you connect with organizations, other welcoming groups, resources, and training. Our next webinar is about housing, which is something that continues to be a really difficult issue, not only for refugees, but also asylum seekers and many different communities. So we're going to be talking about creative housing solutions for refugees and asylum seekers on July 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We would love to have you join us. And finally, again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me at welcome@mcc.org. And without further ado, I will let you all go in peace.